All right, now let's turn to clauses. Whereas phrase means a grouping of nominals, a clause is this kind of configuration where you have nominal clusters, whether it's just one word or multiple words, so phrases, that sort of group around a verbal form, a verbal. So this is where you don't just have of the God, but you could say, I heard of the God. So a clause uses a verbal form sort of as its core. If you were to think about an orbit, you'd have, the primary, like the star, and then planets, which are satellites that go around the star. Well, the nominal clusters are kind of like the satellites here, and the verbal form is like the primary. So it's the sort of gravitational center of the clause. So let's just look at a couple and we can sort of get what's going on. A clause is essentially a process. So whereas nominals refer to things, simple things, complex things, pointer things, verbals refer to processes, things that things do, that happen to things, that kind of idea. That's the sort of semantics of verbals. So let's get into some specific examples here. You have simple clauses. Like this first example, the verb is oidete. That means you know. Now that you is plural. You all know. You people know. Oidete. Now in the next example we have oidete autein. Autein here means it. And it's feminine. It means her or it. You know it. You know her. And what you can see is that you've got a nominal, a thing. This in this case it's a pointer thing, pointing to some her that we don't know who it is from this example. But we can imagine from context, there's some her that's out there, and you know her. So you have a verbal, a process. You know, this is something that there's something that takes place, knowing. And then there's a nominal cluster that is a satellite to that. So if we were to draw sort of gravitational orbit, this would be the primary right here, and this thing would have this kind of like orbital around the process. It's not a perfect metaphor, but it's helpful. In the third example, we've got oidete pantes. You know all things. You can think of pan, the word pan, like as in something like Pangea, which is, all of the land or something like that. All the continents together as one. So Pangea. So in this case, we've got pantes. So you know all things. All, and it's plural, so that's why I'm saying all things instead of just, every or something like that. Now, these are some simple clauses here. You know her, you know all things. But you can also have embedded clauses. That means a clause within another clause. You can even have clauses within nominal groups, as we'll see, but let's look at this example. You've got dikaios estin. This means righteous, it is. So you would say something like, it is righteous. And then in the next example, eidete hoti dikaios estin. So eidete, you can maybe see that that's very similar to oidete. It's just a different tense form. So in this case, we might gloss this you knew instead of you know. So you knew that it is righteous. You knew that it is righteous. So here we've got this clause, it is righteous, dikaios estin, and that is embedded within another clause, which is that you knew something. You knew that something. And, if you imagine you could have anything after this, you could have a whole string of clauses. You could have anything after that. But the key is, this is your top level clause. You knew that something. This is this whole thing right here, that it is righteous. That's now a nominal group. It's a nominal group with this clause embedded inside of it. So you've got that it is righteous embedded within this other clause. So this is now the satellite orbiting around this primary. And then things can, of course, get even more complex. Let's look at this example right here, and I'll break it down a little bit more. So we've got grapho humin, I write to you, uk entelein, not a commandment, kainein, new, not a new commandment. So here you recognize entelein kainein. Well, there's a phrase. So I write to you not entelein kainein, not a new commandment, but Allah, but, and you can see the last alpha has dropped off here. So because there was a vowel starting the next word, the last vowel dropped off. So instead of Allah, we've got al. But commandment old, entolein palayan. I write to you not commandment new, but commandment old, which, and you can see that this ending, this relative pronoun here, as you would call it, so this which word matches entolein. So that's telling you what it's talking about. So which, well, what is the which we're talking about? The commandment. It's a commandment which you have had from the beginning. So let's break that down a little more. You've got grapho. That's the first thing you've got. I write. And that's, you could say that's the primary. That's the star in the middle of the system. Then we add one satellite, the first orbital level. I write to you. That's the first nominal group that is orbiting this primary. And then you can say, I write to you. We add another satellite, not a new commandment. So I write to you, first orbital, not commandment new, second orbital. Next orbital, but commandment old. So look at the way the units are building up here. I write to you, uk entolein kainen, not this thing, but this other thing, but entolein palayan, not commandment new, but commandment old. And then we add another one, commandment old, which you have, or you could say which you have had. So you've got, I write to you not commandment new, but commandment old which you have had. And then the final thing we add is from the beginning, ap archais, from an archaic time, as you might think about it. So you see how we just progressively add on more and more, orbits, you could say, to this system. Let's look at this broken down into the different kinds of units we've seen so far. We've seen phrases and we've seen clauses, so we can actually distinguish those. So what we've got here is the verbals are green in this clause. We've got grapho humin, so I write to you. The nominals are surrounded by these orange brackets. So you got to you as the first nominal, entolein kainen, new command, as the second nominal, entolein palayan, and then you've got this sort of embedded thing. So you got entolein palayan, old command old, which you have had from the beginning. And so that's sort of a little nominal group that's part of this bigger thing. So you got one big nominal group here, or phrase, and it's got a little one embedded inside of it. And so the key thing to recognize here is that this is all one big verbal cluster. This is the primary at the center of the star system, and these are all satellites. Humin, that's a satellite. Not a new command, that's a satellite. But an old command which you've had from the beginning, that's a satellite. And then within this little nominal group here, you've got which you had from the beginning. This is an embedded clause. So you have this verbal, you have. That's a process, having something. Now, maybe it's a static process, nothing really changes, but it's a process nevertheless. And then you have a couple of satellites. You've got which. And of course, that's a pointer thing, because it's not actually, you don't know what it is without context. Here, it's a commandment. It's a commandment which you have had, and you've had it for how long? From the beginning. That's sort of another circumstance that's orbiting around this verbal in the middle here. So that's the key thing to this, is things can get very complex, but the very complex configurations that you're looking at, they're just made up of these little configurations. And so that's why we're going through and we're learning the phrases and we're learning the clauses, because you have to learn these units, because these are the units that actually make the text. Now you could say, well, you have to just learn the words, but it's not as helpful just to learn individual words as it is to recognize these different syntactic patterns. You've got these nominal groups and you've got these verbals, and that they work together in these kind of orbital systems, where the verbal group is going to be the center of the system, the primary. But even within a nominal group, you're going to have, command new. Now, new is a simple thing. It's just a property, right? It's like, new, blue, green, yellow, old. Those are all properties. Those are simple things. The simple things orbit around the complex things, like a command. Well, what's a command? Well, it's something that, I don't even know how to describe it. A command could have all kinds of properties. So it's a complex thing. It's a complex thing that has a simple thing orbiting around it. So, or you could say modifying it or something like that to use more traditional terminology. So let's look at one more of these. Here we've got a whole other clause, but what you can see is this is one big nominal cluster, one big phrase. And then you've got the verbal and another phrase. So this is actually just one clause with one verbal. So that's the star at the middle of the system. And it's got two planets or satellites. So you've got the second one here is from the Father. You saw in a previous slide of the Father, to Patros. Well, here if you add the word from in front of that, you don't have to say from of the Father, but you can put it all together and say, well, it's this from the Father kind of construal. And the first nominal group here, this one is really long, but it's not actually very complex. And I'll tell you why. It's because it's joined together. It's sort of, you see this word chi right here? We're going to look at that coming up in one of the upcoming lessons. But what that's doing is it's sort of just compounding on the group that's already there. So if we were to go through this, we'd say pan. Well, you saw pan earlier. That was like Pangea, like the whole continent thing. So this means all or everything. And then we've got a little group here. We've got the in the world. To en to cosmo. We saw to cosmo earlier. That was of the world. This is to cosmo. That means in the world. And then this word en, that just means in. It sounds kind of like in English, en. So we've got the in the world. So you might say, the thing in the world. And then with this property pan, we've got everything in the world. And then, we could put a little comma right here or something. We would say the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes. So remember we saw desire of the flesh and we also saw desire of the eyes. See, this is why it's actually really, really, really helpful to learn these phrases, because you've seen now the desire of the flesh. He epithumia tes sarkos. You may not have memorized it by now, but that's okay. You're beginning to be able to put together these phrases, and then you're able to sort out what the configuration is of these phrases into clauses. So we have the desire of the flesh, and kai, what you can see here, the desire of the eyes. He epithumia ton ophthalmon. So we have the desire of the eyes, and a third thing, he alazonia to biu. Now, you haven't learned this one yet, at least in the slides, but you can maybe begin to put together, well, what might that be? Especially if you know 1 John chapter 2. But this says something like the boasting of the life, or the boasting of life. So we have here everything which is in the world. Well, what are those things? The desire of the flesh. And another thing, another nominal group, the desire of the eyes. And a third nominal group, the boasting of life. The boasting of life. And so we can begin to put this all together and say, well, whatever this whole nominal group is right here, it is from the Father. Now you might be thinking, well, that can't be right. Well, that's because there's more context here. Somewhere at the front of this, in front of this clause, you're going to have a word like not. So it's something like not everything which is in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes and the boastfulness of life is from the Father. So that's not the case. But here we don't have that context. So we just have is from the Father. So you just have to live with that ambiguity, I suppose. So let's move on and look at two different kinds of verbals